Hello, Comparative Politics class. Dr. Maiden here. This is going to be lecture CPO 4.5. So this is kind of part 2 in our series on international development. CPO 4.5, International Development Case Studies. Okay, but before we dive in here, the theme of today's lecture is going to be magic, 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 magic. So I have a deck of cards here. This is a regular deck of cards, right? Everything's in the deck. I am going to shuffle it and I'm going to pick a card and then show you that card. All right, this is going to be pretty cool. Hold on a second. All right, let's see. The card I'm going to pick is King of Diamonds. King of Diamonds. See, so I shuffled it. King of Diamonds. Damn it. All right, here we go. Let me two tries. I'm going to do two more tries. 3 tries total. King of Diamonds, King of Diamonds, King of Diamonds. Damn it, it's a diamond. I'm getting closer. All right, we're warming it up. Warming up the deck. King, 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 King of Diamonds. Damn it. All right, so this is international development case studies. So actually what kind of happened here was when I did the first lecture on international development, I realized that actually it's a lot of content. So you may have noticed if you were looking through the PowerPoint slides, I didn't get to all of those slides. So what we're doing today is actually kind of like a mashup of I want to finish some of the things that were on those slides because they're really important and put them in the context of some case studies for us to be thinking about. All right, so this one I want us to start and be very political science-y here for a minute, right? That's what we're doing. This is a political science class. And so there's these 2 very important questions that we can ask as political scientists about international development. So the first one is, what type of government is most likely to pursue beneficial development policies? Okay, so here, if you're thinking back to some of the foundations of comparative politics here, some of the big themes in comparative politics, we have done a lot of work this semester looking at regimes, regime type, regime change, okay? So this question, is there a type of regime that is more likely to pursue beneficial development policies? Is there a type of regime that's better at this, okay? Comment down below if you think you have an answer. Again, thinking as a political scientist, rooting your answer in some causal explanation, some theoretical explanation. Why? If you think there is a certain one that is better at this, why do you think they're better at it? Okay, comment down below if you have an idea. The second question, this is really digging down to this another layer here. Do democracies or dictatorships produce better economic development? Okay, so the first question is just broadly speaking, what type of government is more likely to pursue beneficial policies? The second one is get comparatively, right? This is comparative politics class, comparing these 2, democracy or dictatorship. Which is going to do this better between these 2? What does the literature tell us? So this is political science literature across the board, big country case studies, small individual country case studies, all kinds of work has been done on this. And so obviously there are some expectations in terms of pro-democracy, right? That's probably what most of you are thinking is democracies are better at this. So the expectation should be in your mind, democracies are better at this. Democracies pursue better economic, more beneficial economic development policies, right? So the pro-democracy literature, there is quite a bit of it that says, yes, democracies are better at this. So one of the things that you can find in the literature is this idea of it's freedom, even more so than democracy. It's the freedoms that come with democracy that produce the best kinds of development, the highest advances in development come when you have the most expansive, civic, social, political freedoms, all right? So essentially the argument is you can't develop to your maximum potential without these freedoms. So even if a dictatorship is able to pursue some economic development, they're not going to reach this other plateau unless they have freedoms. That's one argument. Another argument is something we've been talking about quite a bit throughout the semester, the idea that democracy promotes things necessary for good development. They promote accountability. They promote stability, rule of law, all right? Another one that can be quite interesting here is the idea that democracy tends to encourage the creation of left-leaning parties. And so left-leaning parties in particular tend to favor social programming. So we're going to be talking about that in the next 3 lectures. The end of this semester, we're writing out all types of different looks at social programming, welfare, healthcare, environmental policies, etc. But it's no mystery that the countries that have the highest Human Development Index score, the countries that have the highest human capital scores, tend to be hybrid socialist democracies. Okay, so like the Nordic model. Remember we talked about that in a previous lecture. Sweden, Finland, Norway. They have strong social programming on top of democracy, and so they have the strongest development scores. All right. However, all of that aside, this idea of, yeah, democracy is what is needed. Again, what does the literature tell us when we really look at where we're going to see development take place, who is best at doing development? The bottom line here is that in reality, when it comes to the literature, it's kind of a wash. It is kind of a wash in all reality as to whether democracies or dictatorships are better at this, okay? If anything, a lot of the literature shows that democracies can actually hinder good economic development policies. So something like pushing democracy on a poor country too soon, pushing them to transition into democracy will produce neither healthy democracy nor economic development. We've got lots of case studies we can think about of this, and I'm going to highlight a couple in the next couple of slides here. Something else that we can think about is the fact that literature shows us democracy impedes growth. It can impede growth because the focus is too much on consumption over investments. So you can imagine this even in the case of our own country. And this again links to several of the things we've talked about if you compare something like CMEs to LMEs, liberal market economies, like what the US is. If you have a government, let's say the government has a surplus. These are very rare. Governments don't often have surpluses. We tend to have only debt. But imagine if you are in some type of development scheme as a country, let's just throw one out, let's just say Thailand. Thailand is doing these development schemes and they end up having a surplus. The people in Thailand are most likely going to be pushing their democratic leaders to spend that money. Be like, look, we've got the money to spend. Let's build more schools. Let's build a hospital, build new roads, pave new roads, hire more people, right? It's like, let's spend that money and develop even more. The challenge here is that to really reach, again, like if we're thinking of these plateau levels, if we're going from level 2 development to level 4 development, you have to have long-term investing going on as well. So if the government is stuck between this rock and hard place of civilians pushing them to spend any surplus money they have immediately and not saving it for a rainy day, right? That's not sexy. People are like, oh, let's just put it into a fund and have 1% annual growth, whatever. We're like, boo, build more schools, okay? So dictatorships can actually resist these pushes from civilians to spend the money. They can resist it better and say, no, we're putting it in this rainy day fund for 1% annual growth, okay? There's also something to the argument that development will actually move at a much more rapid pace if there are fewer veto players making decisions. And what we mean here, again, you can imagine, if you have a kind of a cumbersome democratic process where something has to be approved by the House, and then it has to be approved by the Senate, and then you have to have a president sign off on it, and then it has to go through implementation, right? That can be a cumbersome process, and there can be a lot of hurdles along the way and a lot of veto players saying no. In dictatorships, there are fewer veto players. So if you're really trying to like kickstart or do like a life support, what is that thing, like a defibrillator, right? If we're trying to defibrillate the economy, a dictatorship is better placed to do that because there are less veto players, right? The dictator can just grab those paddles and say, charge, all right? Overwhelmingly, and here's where we'll end with this look at what does the literature tell us. So we've said, okay, democracy has some benefits, dictatorships, weirdly, have some benefits in this case. Overwhelmingly, though, when we look at what matters the most for economic development, the thing that matters the most is actually functioning bureaucracy. It does not matter if you have a democracy or a dictatorship. What really matters if you want to see good growth is a functioning bureaucracy, no matter what form the government takes. So a strong state with a strong, competent bureaucracy that can actually keep the government moving forward. That's what you need. So whether it's a democracy that has a strong bureaucracy or a dictatorship that has a strong bureaucracy, you need people on the ground in bureaucratic positions, just keeping that ball rolling uphill, right? Pushing that boulder up that hill. That's ultimately what it comes down to, is what you need, all right? So let's take a quick break here, and then we'll come back together and we'll move through some of these eras of development and talk about how, even though we know kind of what works, or we've been learning over time what works, we're sort of not changing our model of behavior. If anything, we're digging even deeper into this goal that we have of promoting democracy with development. Okay, so we'll take a quick break, but first I will say, before we leave for the break, I will say the magic word is, right, magic is our theme today, the magic word is rabbit. Rabbit. All right, we'll be right back together. Okay, so there were a few kind of eras of development that we're going to talk about. So the first era here, the ISI era, import substitution industrialization. Import substitution industrialization, ISI. So this was a development policy that was very popular from around the 1950s to the 1970s. And the goal here was using trade policy, monetary policy, currency rates to encourage the creation of new industries to produce goods domestically that countries had imported in the past. So remember from our previous lecture how a lot of the international development agenda was guided by kind of the law of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage, this idea that you have a comparative advantage perhaps in one good or 2 to 3 goods that you can produce really, really well compared to other countries, and you are going to trade that thing for the other things that you need, okay? This kind of proved devastating. For some, not all. Again, what we can think about is, okay, by the time we were really harping down on this comparative advantage model, you had countries like the US that, because of their policies of being able to outsource things, were already able to have, like, light manufacturing in the US was already transitioning to more heavy manufacturing by the time some of the countries, let's say former colonies, right? So if we're talking 1960 is when a lot of the end of colonization happened. So you have countries emerging out of colonization, completely devastated by colonization. All of the land had been taken during the period of colonization and turned into single cash crop farming, let's say something like cotton. So you have the US that's already up here saying, we're already in complicated manufacturing. We do TVs and radios and cars. And then a country like Mali is coming forward and we're saying, okay, you're way down here, but you have a comparative advantage on that thing. So keep doing that thing that makes you hardly any money. And we'll keep doing more and more and more complicated manufacturing that makes us a lot of money. But keep doing your thing because we still need cotton. We still need tobacco. We still need sugar, okay? We're not going to do it because comparative advantage tells us not to. You have to do it and make a lot less money than us, all right? So that policy had been in place for quite a long time, and countries were feeling like this is not working for us. These developing or attempting to develop countries saying this is not working for us. We can't just keep being your cash crop country. We have to attempt something new. So import substitution industrialization came in to say, all right, we have to start producing things once upon a time that we were producing, because we can't keep up this rate of importing so much of the things that we need. So the 3 country case studies that are really good examples of this are Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey. So they were kind of already, if we're thinking, if the US is up here and you have countries like Mali emerging down here, you have this kind of middle tier of countries that really are moving towards development, like a Brazil, a Turkey, a Mexico. They attempted this. But what do you think is needed in order to start, or in a lot of cases, restart an entire industry? You've got to take on a lot of debt, as you have to open new manufacturing sources. You have to buy a lot of perhaps raw materials, start new programs, buy new factories, buy new machinery, train people on how to use the machinery. And so it can be very expensive. So actually what ended up happening here is these countries buried themselves in debt attempting to do this, attempting to restart new industries or start new industries. It led to a global debt crisis. It led to a global debt crisis, and these countries that were able to make gains, because it worked for a while until it didn't. They were able to make gains until they slid back down into this debt crisis, and it triggered globally a debt crisis by the end of the 1970s. So countries came along, right? The developed world came along and said, okay, that didn't super work. Let's think of something else that we could try. So here we have the 1980s. We have the creation of structural adjustment programs, SAP programs, structural adjustment programs. And here again, it's let's really hone in on neoliberal capitalism. Let's think about the principles central to neoliberal capitalism: reduced government protection of industries, fiscal austerity, privatization, and let's really push, let's force, right? These are the words to think of, force, not, people aren't opting in to do this in most cases. Countries were not opting into this. They were forced to participate in SAP programs. Countries that did this, Chile, parts of Southeast Asia, Kenya, they were able to do this more effectively than others. A lot of the countries across sub-Saharan Africa in particular were forced into this model of let's do this SAP model, where we are going to have a very, the kind of the joke's on us. The whole point of neoliberal capitalism is it's a hands-off model. But what we did is we took very heavy hands-on to these countries and said, adjust to the neoliberal model. So we are going to put our hands, our claws, all up in your business, and we are going to force you to shift whatever your fledgling country economic political system looks like. We're going to force it into a neoliberal model because that's the future for you. We're just going to force it on you now. Again, if we go to the previous slide, before you're ready. We're going to force it on you before you're ready. And so what happens? It does not create healthy democracy. It does not create healthy economic development. If anything, it created the opposite. So SAP programs were roundly a failure across particularly the continent where they were most heavily implemented, which would have been sub-Saharan Africa, roundly a failure. Then you had countries like Japan, South Korea, Ghana, which approached something that we call the developmental state. So this wasn't necessarily an era because there's only been a couple of countries that actually managed this and managed it well. But this is where a couple of these states really encouraged what we call export-oriented growth, an export-oriented growth model of development. And so they said, all right, what we're going to do, similar to a comparative advantage model, but a little bit different, because they're thinking very strategically about future growth, right? What is our future growth? We can't just sit here and make cotton forever. We have to do something else. Or in the case of Japan, we can't just make rice forever. We have to start getting into other industries here. So they started with export-oriented growth models, tend to start with light manufacturing, typically textiles, and then you shift from that into more and more advanced manufacturing to the point where Japan, even something like the Sharp factory, right? Sharp, which does a whole host of electronics, they started doing mechanical pencils, okay? I've been to the Sharp factory in Japan. It's actually really fascinating. The like perfecting the art of the mechanical pencil is something that is a very much more of a light manufacturing model, leading to now you have sharp electronics that can corner the market in TVs and gaming consoles and what have you. So they have been able to do that model very well, and it has worked for them. Again, it doesn't work for everyone who tries it. Japan and South Korea are examples of it working really well. Ghana on the African continent, an example of this working better to their advantage. The last one we'll talk about in terms of an era then is called what we call the pink tide. So the pink tide, this was, again, because of the ISI generation and the SAP generation in Latin America, the 1980s is largely referred to as a quote-unquote lost decade, the lost decade of development because of all of these interfering policies that were put into place and didn't end up doing what they were expected to do. So what you had across Latin America was what we call the pink tide, and this is I don't love the terminology here because it's the idea here is like pinko-commie, right? Pink being communism, socialism. Pink tide being a rejection of neoliberal policies in favor of greater social programming. So again, interestingly, from the research, we know actually democracy can be good if it allows for the creation of left-wing parties that do promote social programming. You don't have to have democracy to promote social programming, though. If you go the route of socialism, you can have a government that is forcing those policies, left-wing policies that are attempting to promote human development. And so that's what they did. They basically said, enough of this. This is not working for us. You have been shoving this down our throats for decades. It's not working. We're going to try something totally new and do our own thing. So you had this wave, right? The pink tide, the pink wave. Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Venezuela, all these countries joining this movement and saying, enough of doing things your way. We're going to attempt to do things our way. And what we know from previous lectures as well is this wasn't as much of a success either, because you had still a lot of issues of government turnover, coup activity, right? It did not stabilize the region the way you would have hoped that it could have. Countries are being able to transition out of that and are stabilizing more than they have been in the past, and you are getting more growth happening on the continent. But it was a very tough time. It was a very tough time of transition, of just saying, we cannot keep doing things your way. We have to be able to try things our way and see if we can do any better. Okay. So if we think about where we are now, 21st century, 2020, where are we now? A scholar like Paul Collier in 2007 coined this term, the bottom billion. The bottom billion is the population of the poorest countries on earth, most of them are in Africa, who seem to be quote unquote left behind by globalization. So I already said a lot of the countries of Africa were forced to participate in SAP programming in the 80s. These were largely unsuccessful programs, so that by 2015, 23 of the 25 bottom countries on the Human Development Index, the HDI, right, they were in Africa, 23 of the bottom 25. There was a near total failure to create economic growth or reduce poverty. And a big challenge here, if we go back to what works, what actually works in promoting economic development, we said the number one thing is a strong state. Whether it's a democracy or dictatorship, you need a strong state with a strong bureaucracy. Does that describe most of the states in sub-Saharan Africa? No. They have very weak institutions which are unfriendly to the market. So if you have high rates of corruption, high rates of patronage politics, frequent outbursts of violent conflict, history of coup and regime change, military coup, is that a good investment? Do people want to move their factories to Nigeria or to Equatorial Guinea if there's going to be coup after coup after coup? No. If there's corruption out the wazoo, if you can't get a business moving forward without having to pay off every government official along the way, do you think anyone's going to start a business in your country? No. So there's a big challenge here of weak institutions keeping these countries back as one side of it. The other side, we can argue, is our interference with these adjustment programs that we attempted to do, forced on them. The literature shows us, it's very clear, if you force these on a poor country, a weak country, too soon, you will not create healthy democracy or healthy economic development. You just won't. But we kept trying, and it failed, right? So what we had then leading up to the 21st century, and now that we're kind of in the early 21st century, the UN created what we call it started as the Millennium Development Goals. We have now transitioned to it. We call the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm popping them up here. 17 goals to transform our world is what we call it. And it's basically this idea of focusing on, okay, we are all in here with Sen's idea of promoting human development, and that promoting human development in a sustainable way will necessarily improve economic development as well. So you can see these goals really run the gamut. Everything from clean water and sanitation, sustainable cities, reduced inequalities, affordable and clean energy. The emphasis here being, for the longest time, we're attempting to address the challenge facing the bottom billion, the challenges facing the bottom billion, and bringing them up out of poverty, ending this idea of people living on less than $2 a day. Okay. So largely what we have done, and this ties in a lot with aid policies that we have pursued as well, is we have pursued what we call this good governance agenda. And we have tied this very tightly onto sustainable development goals, so that even with the way the US gives money to countries, it could be that, all right, we will give you money to pursue some type of programming related to reducing infant mortality rates, but we will only give it if you host a free and fair election, or if you improve your transparency and make public some of your government spending accounts. Okay, so we will kind of hold aid hostage, we will hold economic development hostage from countries unless they are conforming to our goals of promoting what we say is quote unquote good governance, which is neoliberal democratic capitalism. So again, we're doing the same model of, it doesn't matter if the literature says you can develop as a dictatorship, you can improve human development scores as a dictatorship if you have a good bureaucracy to do it. We don't care about that. What we care about is promoting and expanding the reach of neoliberal democratic capitalism. Okay, so the good governance agenda puts countries in a box and will say you can only get access to aid, you can only get access to economic support, you can only get access to funding if you play our game our way. So this has been the newest iteration of kind of the ISI era, the SAP era, of us coming from the West, coming from the developed side, pushing appropriate models onto people that we would say are less developed, least developed, developing. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I don't want these lectures to get too long. But comment down below if you have any ideas here as to why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep kind of dressing up this same thing in different costumes, right? Of saying, we know the literature shows us that this doesn't necessarily work the way we think it's going to work, and yet we just won't stop trying to make it work. Okay, it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating if you feel like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. And we kind of have been doing the same thing over and over in terms of promoting international development. It's very interesting. It's very frustrating, right? I would love to hear some of your comments, especially if this is the first that you've heard about some of these models, the first that you've seen these trends over time outlined in terms of international development, especially because I wouldn't be surprised if at least a couple of you were sitting there thinking you want to get involved in this. You want to work in the field of international development, whether as a scholar, as a practitioner, as a policymaker. I'd love your thoughts as well as to what you think about this and what you think we could do differently, right? All right, I'll stop there, and I hope you guys have a great day.